If you have a smart speaker, you have access to the entire world of NPR and St. Louis Public Radio. All the latest news and all the captivating stories. Activate our voices with yours by telling your smart speaker to play St. Louis Public Radio.
From St. Louis Public Radio. This is the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. I'm Jason Rosenbaum. On this final day of 2024, this was a year that brought some massive changes to Missouri, St. Louis, and Illinois politics. Especially in Missouri, the election dominated the last 12 months, even in non-electoral arenas like the Missouri General Assembly. And when the smoke cleared, voters picked new leaders in key Jefferson City offices and in Washington, D.C. We'll get to Missouri's top stories later in the show, but we want to start with stories that define the year in Illinois politics. Because the state holds its statewide elections during non-presidential cycles, the election wasn't as all-consuming as it was in the Show Me state. But that didn't mean the primary and general elections didn't showcase some intriguing things about political dynamics in the Metro East and beyond. Joining us to discuss the stories in Illinois politics throughout 2024 is Will Bauer, STLPR's Metro East reporter. Welcome, Will.
Thanks, Jason.
Also joining us is Brian Munoz, St. Louis Public Radio's visual editor and a native of the Metro East. Brian, welcome back to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air.
Hey, Jason. Thanks for having me.
When we polled STLPR's politics team about the top story in Illinois politics, the clear winner was the trial of former House Speaker Michael Madigan. Madigan is not from the Metro East, but he did play a gigantic role in Illinois politics. Gigantic may be understating it a little bit. Will, why do you think this trial captured so much attention, even hundreds of miles away from Chicago?
He's the longest serving leader of any state or federal body in U.S. history. So, I mean, he's just a legendary figure in Illinois politics, and the fact that he's on trial for racketeering and bribery is probably drawing a lot of eyes.
He was actually speaker before I was born. So that was my favorite fact. It's not true anymore, Brian. He's no longer the Speaker of the House, and he might be going to jail. He also was a boogeyman for many people in the Metro East. Can you kind of talk about that?
Yeah, I think Mike Madigan was really emblematic of the quote-unquote machine in Illinois politics. And I think if you ask anyone that lives in Illinois, there's a disdain, in Southern Illinoisans and some folks in the Metro East with Chicagoans, and this cultural identity split that's been very well reported on and documented. And I think when you look at corruption in Illinois, Madigan is one of the people that comes initially to mind. So I believe he was very much on the minds of folks in the Metro East and across the state, on this is emblematic of the issues of Illinois. You look at the legacy of corruption and dark money, and Madigan was part of all of that.
Madigan was a foil, I think, for a lot of Republicans who have made some inroads in the Metro East. But he's been gone from the legislative scene for a couple of years now. Do you think that this trial rekindled some of the bad memories of the Madigan years in the Metro East? Will?
I'm sure it did, right? When you had served as the Speaker of the House from 1983 with a 2-year break in the middle of the 90s, as our Jonathan Ahl would point out when he was covering him, to 2021. I'm sure there is, yeah. He was a legendary figure in Illinois politics, and when he's brought back up with Illinois having the history of how many governors have ended up in prison over the last 30, 40 years, I'm sure it does, yeah.
So let's zoom in a little bit, because perhaps the most high-profile and bruising election was the GOP primary between Congressman Mike Bost and former GOP gubernatorial hopeful Darren Bailey. Bost prevailed, but not by a particularly strong margin, given his endorsement from President-elect Donald Trump. Brian, you were in Murfreesboro for Bost's win. Do you think the fact he was able to edge out Bailey says anything at all about where the Republican Party is nationally and in Illinois?
I think this was probably Mike Bost's most serious challenge in recent history. The only other challenge that came semi-close was Brendan Kelly, the Democrat that ran in 2018, who's now the head of Illinois State Police. And, the Democrats really didn't have a candidate that was competitive. So this was truly a test of, is extreme MAGA Trumpism going to edge out somebody that has been in Southern Illinois, is a native of Murfreesboro, was a firefighter, has served on the Veterans Affairs Committee, was a ranking member. He has this clout from serving his time in office. And I think people remember that. And I think that really helped him, secure that seat. But, Mike Boss said at the time, challenges are healthy. They keep us, sharp. There were some barbs traded back and forth during the primary, but now I think it's full steam ahead on what's going to be going on in Congress.
Will, do you think that Bost could be vulnerable in future elections, given that his margin of victory, as I mentioned, was not that big?
2.8 percentage points was the final margin, and that is with the Trump endorsement. So I remember Boss telling you and I, Jason, that if he endorses Bailey, I think he said that's going to be really, really bad. If the Trump endorsement goes a different way, if Bailey were to run again, which he has said he's not going to, and they've shaken hands and they've pledged unity, and they did that over the summer at the GOP convention in Milwaukee. But if he did decide to get back in, I think, the way this district has been drawn, it is the most Republican district in the state, R plus 29. So it's impossible for a Democrat to compete. Absolutely. If Darren Bailey wanted to get involved again, it would be a very close fight again.
Well, let's talk about another story, and that's a big shakeup in Madison County government going into 2025. Well, what happened with board chairman Kurt Prenzler?
He's out of office for the first time in the county, from a countywide office for the first time in 14 years. Lost to Chris Lesser in a pretty decisive victory for the new, I guess now, county chairman who had been the treasurer before. But it's a big shift. Prenzler was kind of the first Republican to really break through Madison County's longtime Democratic control. John Shimkus was the first person before that in the 90s, but Prenzler was really the person to do it at the countywide level in the early 2010s, and it's now become a Republican stronghold, and definitely some big differences in between the way Prenzler and Slesser will operate the county.
Yeah, you mentioned in your write-up that there's a big stylistic difference between the two. Can you elaborate on what you mean by that?
Yeah, so Slesser had kind of grown critical of Prenzler getting involved in non-county board issues. Prenzler was the type of person that would send out a lot of op-eds just about any of the issues that was on his mind. He started getting involved in local library board races, recruiting candidates to run. He'd push back against statewide COVID mandates, and Slesser had really said, I don't necessarily disagree with you on those issues, but that's not the first priority for the county board chairman. You need to be worried about particularly economic development was Slesser's take, and that's something that he really wants to prioritize, and all those other issues are secondary.
Sticking with Madison County, there was a vote on a resolution approving of succession there. This is symbolic. Madison County isn't going anywhere. It's not going to become like the People's Republic of Madison County, although I think it would be the opposite, given that it's very Republican and not a communist enclave. But Brian, you grew up in the Metro East. You still have family there. Do you think that people who are not immersed in Illinois politics see these types of things as a strong message or just a stunt?
I think it really boils back to that animosity with Chicago, Cook County, that corner of the state, and everybody else for the most part. And I think most people just kind of roll their eyes at the matter. I was talking to some sources last night who work in Springfield, and they see this as more of an attention-grabbing political stunt, really, than something that's going to actually have some weight. There is little to no chance that Illinois somehow splits, its Cook County, Chicago area with the rest of the state, or Illinois seceding from the United States. That's very unlikely, to happen.
But this isn't the first county to do this. There have been a lot of smaller counties. But what do you think the significance of Madison County voters making this statement was?
It's the first non-rural county. So 33 have now passed these symbolic measures, and they had been tucked away largely in the southeast corner of the state. Pretty small population, but Madison County is a suburban county, if you will. 265,000 people live there. So I think a lot of the supporters in Madison County who would back this measure would say this shows that it's not just a urban versus rural issue. It is maybe a bigger downstate versus Chicago issue.
One of the things, Will, you have been following is the political trajectory in St. Clair County. I would say that's probably the most Democratic county in the Metro East. Is that fair to say?
For sure, yeah.
Republicans, though, are making inroads. Adding to that, Democrats failed to take back a legislative seat in the county. What do you think that says about where St. Clair County is from a political perspective?
So Republicans are optimistic that one day they could start winning some countywide seats, take back even more legislative seats. So the broad trend is, if you take contested countywide races, 20 years ago, Democrats were winning those by 20 points or in the teens. Now they're winning by single digits. Now, some would say Obama had really propped up the Democratic Party locally because he was an Illinois guy, and he, in 2008 and in 2012, his presidential years brought them to big victories. But others would say, hey, now it's only the margin's getting closer for Republicans, so we're optimistic. Whether or not they can make that happen in 2026, which is off years generally pretty bad for the party in power, we'll see if that happens.
I think it was noteworthy that Vice President Kamala Harris ran 6 points behind Joe Biden in Illinois in 2024 compared to 2020. I don't know if that means if Illinois is shifting to the right, but should it be a sign of optimism given how dominant Democrats have been in the state since 2018?
I think, optimism, either party, is a good thing. You want people to run good, hard-fought campaigns, no matter what side of the aisle you're on. But I think, it's going to be a tall order to ask Republicans necessarily to take over St. Clair County. I mean, you're starting to see it in Madison County, so it's definitely within the realm of possibility. But I think you saw similar issues in the county that you saw nationally when it comes to messaging. Abortion was a big one early on, and that kind of dwindled as they changed their messaging on the Democratic side in East St. Louis. And I think people are really concerned about those kitchen table issues, the economy, inflation, things of that nature that maybe weren't hammered in as much. And I think that's where you start to see Republican gains who definitely emphasize that point a little more during the campaign.
Will Bauer covers the Metro East for St. Louis Public Radio, and Brian Munoz is STLPR's visual editor. Thank you both for being here.
You bet, Jason.
Thanks, Jason.
When we return, we'll talk about the top stories of the year in St. Louis and Missouri politics. This is the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air.
The Gateway brings you the day's news each weekday from around the St. Louis region and the state capitals in Jefferson City.
Our schools are accredited. We don't need this bill.
And Springfield.
How many more years must pass before lawmakers see time is of the essence?
I'm Abby Larico. Join me each weekday for The Gateway on the STLPR app or wherever you get podcasts.
Welcome back to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. I'm Jason Rosenbaum. 2024 brought about one of the most crucial election cycles in Missouri's recent history. Thanks to what happened over the past 12 months, the Show Me State's leadership in the state capitol and in Washington, D.C. will be much different in 2025. But 2024 also saw legislative and legal turmoil and the passage of some critical ballot initiatives. And here to break down the top stories is STLPR's justice reporter, Rachel Lippman. Rachel, welcome.
Always fun to be here, Jason.
And also joining us is Sarah Kellogg, St. Louis Public Radio State House and politics reporter. Sarah, welcome back to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air.
Of course, Jason. Happy to be here.
Now, before we get to the top 5 stories of the year, I do want to get to some honorable mentions that didn't make the cut. Rachel, you pointed to earnings tax refunds in the city of St. Louis. Why did that make your list?
That made my list because that is going to have a major impact on the budget of the city of St. Louis going forward. The earnings tax refunds were always available to people, but I think there is more of an awareness now of it. And it also went retroactively back to during the COVID era, and more people claimed them than the city expected. So now they have to figure out how to cover the cost of those refunds.
Sarah, some members of STLPR's politics team pointed to the very, 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 very narrow passage of a sports betting initiative. And this was something you were following closely. Can you remind us why this was even on the ballot as opposed to something that the legislature could have passed?
Well, it's in part because of the legislature. Like a lot of initiative petitions that we inevitably see in Missouri is that sports betting was there were several attempts by lawmakers to pass sports betting for the last couple of sessions, including the latest one. And in part, mainly to now incoming Secretary of State, but then State Senator Denny Hoskins, it just didn't go anywhere. And I think there was a lot of frustration from the sports teams, and that led them, I basically did a story a year ago saying this might be on the ballot, and sure enough it was, and very, very narrowly passed.
Why do you think it was able to pass even with a lot of opposition from casinos?
I think there was just kind of simplicity. I think there was just a desire for it. A lot of lawmakers I talked to said that was the number one issue that their constituents asked them about, like, why don't we have this? I think it didn't harm them, the fact that most surrounding states in Missouri have sports betting, including Kansas and Illinois, where there were lots of instances of Missourians driving over the border to place bets and come back. So I think that overall there was just kind of a desire for it. I think actually and this is just, who knows, me spitting in the dark here, but if maybe the advertising would have been just, do you want sports betting versus the education angle, I think it might have even passed better. I think there was kind of a discontent with how that was being portrayed.
I ended up picking the retirement of Congressman Blaine Luetkemeyer in the 3rd Congressional District and the ascension of Bob Onder to Congress as one of my top 5 stories, and it did not make the cut. The 3rd District congressional race was not as gigantic as I expected. I expected 10 major candidates, and really there were only 2, Onder and former Senator Kurt Schaefer. It was still expensive and contentious, and now Onder has accomplished something that he first tried to do 16 years ago in 2008. He gets to go to the U.S. House, and he gets to be a member of a GOP majority that's going to have a 2 or 3 seat
I think it's 1 seat when it when Congress initially goes into session, because there are so many former lawmakers nominated to President-elect Trump's cabinet.
He's going to have a great time, and I'm looking forward to seeing how he navigates that body. But let's go to the top 5, and coming in at number 5 is Mike Kehoe, emerging out of the August GOP primary and then winning the governorship in a landslide. Here's Kehoe at his victory party in November.
Missouri is a land of opportunity, a place where every person can succeed regardless of their background. It's a place filled with people who share the same values that we do. It's a place where people pray hard and work hard. I know it's true because I've lived the American dream just like so many of you. And as governor, I'm going to make sure that dream is available to every single person in this state.
That was Governor-elect Mike Kehoe, who will take office in mid-January. Sarah, Kehoe had the most money. He had the most endorsements. People genuinely like him as a person, but he didn't really have a cakewalk to the governorship, especially in the primary. Were you surprised he was able to pull it out?
Ultimately, I wasn't. I think because in part of who his fellow candidates were in the primary, at least the major candidates, and at the time that was State Senator Bill Eigel and Secretary of State Jay Ashcroft. And I think that, I think it was surprising that Eigel ultimately did better than I think people thought he was going to. He actually came in second in that race. And you have to wonder that if it was one of them, if there weren't 2 of them, what that race would have looked like, if Eigel would have been able to pull it off, if Ashcroft would have been able to pull it off as a part of a kind of a further right coalition than Kehoe. So ultimately, I'm not surprised he did it because of the way the race ended up, but it was definitely not the easiest race for him to win because he was kind of constantly fielding accusations that he wasn't Republican enough. Clearly he was for a lot of Republicans, and now he's on his way to the governor's office.
I was less surprised by his victory in November than August. If it would have had to have been an unusually good night for Democrats, for the Democrat to win a statewide office in Missouri. But I was wondering, too, kind of how many, maybe not enough to tip the race, but with, 2 major candidates fighting on his right flank and splitting that vote there, did enough Democrats throughout the state decide, you know what, I can live with a Governor Kehoe and I can live with, whoever also wins in the Democratic primary. So do I advance him through the primary because I can live with him knowing that he's likely to be elected in the general.
There's some general optimism that Kehoe will be a competent steward of state government. He's from Jefferson City. He's talked often about how he interacts with state employees at the grocery store. He wants to do things like raise pay for child abuse investigators, but honeymoon periods can go sideways really quickly. He's not going to have as good of a financial situation as Governor Mike Parson has had over the past couple of years. And he'll have to deal with the right flank of his party that is kind of exemplified by Bill Eigel and others. Sarah, do you think he'll be able to navigate these treacherous political waters effectively?
I think it both helps and hurts him that he was the lieutenant governor for the last kind of couple of years and therefore oversaw the Senate and had kind of more frequent interactions with the senators than with Parson most likely did. You know, he was there gaveling them in and out a lot and kind of saw those dynamics up front. So I think that that'll help him build the connections that he needs if he wants to get legislation passed. But also that means that he's probably butted heads a couple times with maybe some of the Freedom Caucus members. So I'm curious to see, you know, he definitely has policy aspirations, things he wants to get done, not just the budget. And so I'm curious as how that's going to go. I think it's not going to be a cakewalk, but it might be easy for him rather than someone else who just kind of came into the role of governor without having served as lieutenant governor right beforehand.
And Rachel, one of Kehoe's main priorities is reestablishing a gubernatorial board to oversee the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department. He has a pathway to get this done because there's still a supermajority in the legislature, but I definitely expect some opposition from St. Louis elected officials. How do you see that issue shaping up over the next few months?
I think it's going to depend on a couple of things. Number one, they're going to have to craft the message clearly, city leaders, that things are improving. This is one of those situations where the reality that the Republican supermajority in the General Assembly wants to paint is, you know, St. Louis has a lot of crime. It does have a lot of crime, but the numbers are going down. Things are improving. And they have to find the effective messenger to say, what you think you are seeing is not actually what is going on. And this is not uncommon. People believe that violent crime is going up when the numbers are painting an entirely different picture. I think it also depends on what the structure of the board looks like. We have heard from some Democratic former and current and former state representatives that there are some ideas of a state-controlled board that would not be as objectionable to them. And then there's the other question of, you know, is there anyone willing to completely go to the mat anymore and defend local control of the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department?
Let's go to our number 4 story, which is kind of the mirror image of Kehoe winning, and that's Missouri Democrats failing to gain any ground in statewide or legislative races. I have to say, I was kind of surprised. I was expecting Democrats to gain seats in the House. That didn't happen. The numbers stayed the same. They also stayed the same in terms of the Missouri Senate, and the statewide races were not close at all. Sarah, why do you think Democrats weren't able to rise to the occasion in 2024?
I think it was just kind of the trend this election cycle that just mainly shifted right in a big way. I don't think it was a Missouri only thing. I mean, we saw even Democratic strongholds across state kind of, even though they were still Democratic in the end, shifted right. It just kind of was what the theme of this election was. And actually, you know, I was chatting with incoming House Minority Leader Ashley Ani about this. And she said actually the fact that Democrats kind of held strong and kept their numbers, they flipped a seat, but then they lost a seat, actually shows kind of how well their bench is doing and that it wasn't worse in a year that definitely kind of just was a Republican shift in all.
Rachel, one of the data points I noticed was that Kehoe, at a mighty 19% of the vote, actually had one of the best performances by a GOP gubernatorial candidate in the city of St. Louis since 2004. Turnout there was bad, especially compared to St. Louis County. Even though, like, obviously Crystal Quaid still won the city by a large margin, it seems like St. Louis Democrats have some work to do in terms of bringing out their voters. Is that fair to say?
I think Democrats statewide just have to develop their presence in a way that they maybe A, aren't thinking that they have to statewide, and B, in the city, yes, are they simply taking their voters for granted and saying you need to come out because democracy is at stake, or you need to come out because of X, Y, and Z. I don't know how effective that messaging is to the regular general public. Now, again, remember Election Day in the city of St. Louis, you had terrible weather conditions, flooding, that kind of stuff. Did that keep down numbers? But we have had this conversation on Politically Speaking, and I know you've had it with, other people throughout the area, is the Democrats, if they are going to have a shot at statewide offices or at turning the state, they just need to have a presence throughout the state. The election showed that you can't rely on Jackson County, the Kansas City area, Columbia, the Boone County area, and the St. Louis area to get them over the hump. And I think they've got to find a way to go down and talk to people and say, hey, these ballot issues that you're supporting, do you then realize that the other party that you're supporting wants to untangle and undo these ballot issues? And they've just got to figure out a way to invest in the state, run candidates in the state, and find them how to be just messengers, credible messengers of ideas and policy.
One of the candidates that did, I think, try to build the vaunted urban-suburban rural coalition was Lucas Kuntz. Listener Pickett Lima wrote in an email, Lucas Kuntz, rising star potential for U.S. Senate against formidable funding, even with change in tone taken by Holly. We had some real hope for honest and local representation. Kuntz did the best out of the statewide candidates, but losing by double digits is still not that impressive. Sarah, Rachel, why do you think Kuntz wasn't able to catch fire, even though he raised a lot of money and he seemed clearly gained a lot of fans among Missouri Democrats?
Sarah, I'll let you take this one.
I think it just is the case of Missouri politics right now, that it is incredibly hard for a Democrat to win a statewide election. Maybe this is a different story in 15 years, in 10 years, who knows? But I just think that right now it's not possible for that to happen. And you have to think a lot of the money raised by Kuntz was money against Holly, who became a pretty divisive figure after January 6th. I think there's definitely there was anti-Holly sentiments there, and that probably fueled some of the funding as well. I think it ultimately kind of wouldn't matter who Holly would run against because there would be funding. But I don't see it happening in Missouri anytime soon, especially after an election that we thought would have a lot of momentum for Democrats.
And I don't think you're going to see national money flowing into Missouri races until they show that they can make it close. If there were polls showing him or, he puts a 3-4 point up on Holly in a Republican state, then maybe the next time around he gets money towards running against a candidate. 12 points is not going to get you national money.
And I actually talked about this with Missouri Democratic Party Chairman Russ Carnahan, and he said flatly that, Missouri's not seen as a top-tier state right now. Yeah. And that's why Lucas Kuntz didn't get national money. That's why Crystal Quay didn't get money from the Democratic Governors Association. And that seems like inside baseball, but if you don't get those resources, it's a sign that you're not going to win. Because if you were going to win, you would get the millions of dollars that come with that, basically.
Or at least perceive as having a chance to win. That if we put an investment in your race, that maybe those resources will help us earn a pickup, for example. It's a sign that the races are competitive, not necessarily that they think you're going to win, just that they're an investment will make a difference. Making an investment to have a 5-point loss as opposed to a 12-point loss is a lot different than making an investment to flip a 1-point loss to a 2-point victory.
There's been a lot of discussion about what Democrats should do next, including from people like Representative-elect Elizabeth Fuchs of St. Louis.
I have been walking into these spaces like this. What's going on? What are we doing here? What's the strategy? What's the plan? Where does Missouri want to be in 50 years? Who are we? What are we doing? And I think that because for the last decade particularly, people have been playing such a hard game of defense, hopefully this fresh class energy will help to bring some new fire to the strategy.
That was State Representative-elect Elizabeth Fuchs, a Democratic lawmaker from St. Louis. So, Sarah, do you think that some of the new people who are going to be coming into the Missouri House and Senate can maybe provide a little bit more momentum than the people that were leading the charge over the last few years?
I think that remains to be seen. I think that you have to give, I think any Democrat, House Democrat, at least you chat with, is going to give credit to outgoing Minority Leader Crystal Quaid on the bench that she basically worked on building for the last 6 years as leader. And I think that it's always, preferable for new perspectives and new ideas. I think when you're dealing with kind of how to overcome a deficit of members. So I don't think it could hurt them. But I think, again, it's kind of a wait and see kind of issue. It depends on whether or not there are issues they can capitalize or not just, as Rachel mentioned earlier, just defending democracy or these other kind of points that have been kind of the Democratic standard the last couple of elections.
And I think it's also important to remember that they're still playing defense. It's not like they're walking in with all of a sudden a brand new majority where they can go on the offense and advance their policies. This new class, this new momentum, they may be playing defense in different ways, but they're still not coming from a position of strength. And maybe having new blood in there, people who are a little bit less beaten down by just being in the super minority can help, but they're still in the minority. They still have to play defense.
I don't want to be unrealistic. I don't think that Democrats are going to make extreme gains in either the legislature or statewide politics anytime soon. But we do have to point out an important variable that's going to be present over the next few years, and that is that Trump is going to be fading from the scene. He can't run again in 2028. He's going to be in his mid-80s. He's going to be serving in office again, and he may do things that are unpopular even to the Republican base. Democrats have opportunities to pick up anywhere from 2 to 3 seats in the Senate in 2026 in Springfield, the Kansas City area. Sarah, is that kind of the next incremental opportunity for Democrats to break out of their funk, get a little bit of momentum, and put themselves in a trajectory to where they can be stronger in 2028 and 2032?
Yeah, your question kind of was the point I was going to make next, which honestly, at the end of this past, I will be honest, I said this on the show that I fully expected the Missouri House Democrats to break their super minority this year, which did not happen because, again, they basically stayed the same. But at the time, they only needed and still only need 3 seats to flip, then break the super minority. So they would just be in the regular minority instead of the super minority. I think that's incredibly doable. In the Senate, they have to flip 2 seats. And I think that is with Springfield, that's currently Senator Lincoln Huff's piece, his district. Who knows? At this point, Springfield has, I think, 3 House Democrats, where at the time, when Crystal won, she was the only Democrat kind of south of I-70 to win at the time. And now there's 3 of them in Springfield alone. I think that that's doable. So I think it's kind of this isn't maybe the result, obviously isn't the result that Democrats wanted in Missouri, but I think it's kind of like, dust yourself off and try again, because I think it's definitely possible in 26.
We need to take a quick break, but when we return, we'll continue to count down the top Missouri and St. Louis political stories of 2024. This is the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. Welcome back to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. I'm Jason Rosenbaum. We now continue with St. Louis Public Radio's Rachel Lippman and Sarah Kellogg on the top political stories in Missouri and St. Louis in 2024. At number 3 is the failure of Missouri legislators to put a measure on the ballot, making it harder to amend the Constitution. Sarah, this was something that happened primarily because of Missouri Democrats engaging in one of the longest filibusters ever, but it also happened because of GOP infighting. I was frankly surprised of this outcome because I'm always kind of predisposed to expect Republicans to always get their way. What was your reaction in May when this was the outcome of what was arguably the biggest GOP priority in 2024?
It was definitely surprising, but kind of thinking back on it, you have to wonder if this would have been the outcome if members of the Freedom Caucus had not pretty much shut down productivity in the very, very beginning of session. And that kind of set the tone. And this was, the things that they wanted to do. And it's not that other Republicans didn't also want to do it, but it was the method of which that was done. So you have to wonder if there was better rapport between Republicans. Would some of them maybe signed a previous question motion, which I will clarify for listeners is basically a motion to end debate. That's very, very, very rarely used in the Senate. It's pretty much like the nuclear option and would end everything pretty much. And so you have to wonder that would they have gotten the signatures needed if they had a better rapport amongst themselves and were able to stop the Democrats. So it was surprising, but you kind of look at how the trajectory of the last session went. It kind of made sense that ultimately they didn't have the votes needed in the end.
And to take a step back to explain what these changes were, and there were a lot of different ideas, including like raising the threshold from 50% plus one to like 57% in 2023. And then kind of
And this is to pass constitutional amendments or adopt constitutional amendments.
And I think that like the main idea this time around was you had to pass a constitutional amendment in a certain amount of congressional districts. I gotta say though, like no matter how you craft this, I think it was going to be very difficult to get voters to approve a measure that limited their own power to change policy, even if they would have put like favorable ballot language on.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I mean, that was kind of my number one question I asked lawmakers last year was, how do you sell this to voters? How do you say, hey, remember how we don't pass these things that you want, and then you go through the legislature or through the initiative petition process and then pass the things that you want? Do you not want to be able to do that? I feel like that is a very hard sell. And I think that, the first answer I got was then Senate President Pro Tem Caleb Rowden, who went, yeah, that's a really good question. We're figuring out how to sell that. And then kind of after that, it was a lot of like, well, Missourians will understand that like we want the sanctity of the Constitution. And I think my answer was just like, no, they won't, because that's not, that's not an issue if something they really want, like sports betting, is on the ballot and they want that, they're going to vote for that. They're not going to think about how long the state constitution is. So I think that it was going to be a hard sell, I think, even if it were able to make it on the ballot.
See, I kind of not entirely disagree, but I think there's a way to message it as blocking negatives. Do you want to protect life? Do you want to protect liberal policies from being enshrined in our Constitution? Do you want to make sure that like your region of the state has a say and an influence in, politics? And do you want like, the city people in St. Louis and Kansas City to dictate and run how our Constitution is written? I don't know that it would have been as much of a messaging problem if you go at it from like we're playing defense, not offense.
Maybe that's true, but that wasn't the messaging I was getting about the people who wanted for it. And also, 100%. I think that ultimately, again, the anti of whatever amendment that would have been incredibly strong. It would have been incredibly well funded. And the message is simple. Do you because you can say, hey, way back when you voted for this, when it was a Republican, minority and you got these things passed, didn't you like doing that? I think that ultimately, and you have to think about, it is a majority that passed, Medicaid expansion and minimum wage hike. You're going to get a majority of people there that, oh, did you like you voting for that? So I think the anti was going to be really strong and hard to overcome. And I think the messaging, they hadn't settled on that yet. And we'll never know what that would have been, obviously, because it didn't make the ballot, but who knows?
I think we need to talk about like why the initiative petition process has been used so much. And Sarah, when we were talking with Governor Mike Parson about how a lot of left-leaning initiative petitions managed to pass during his tenure in office, he brought up a point about it can be a release valve for voters who are upset over the legislature's inaction on things.
If the legislative body don't come up with a solution, and this goes on year after year and is an issue people really care about, sooner or later they go to the initiative petition process and they find a way to fund that. And they go around to the legislative branch. I would tell you that the legislative body sure needs to pay attention to that, because what they're basically saying, you're not getting this passed, whether it's conservative or whether it's a non-conservative issue, so we're going to take it upon ourselves to do it. And I've been pretty open about the initiative petition process. I do think there need to be reform to that. But the legislative body, the Republican or Democrat side of it, at some points you got to unite with what it is you believe, and you got to figure out solutions. When you start dividing ourselves up amongst ourselves and you get nothing done, the everyday person out there is tired of that. I'm just telling you. They want you to come up here and do something. They expect you to do something. And I think those are the things you learn setting out from being able to sit in both those chambers and out from the governor's view. Inaction is not a very good plan.
That is Governor Mike Parson talking with both me and Sarah Kellogg earlier this year. I mean, the governor's right. If the legislature had done something on sports betting, on marijuana legalization, on Medicaid expansion, if they had not passed such a restrictive abortion ban, I don't think the initiative petition process would be used in any of those instances. What do you think, Sarah?
I think there's just a kind of just disconnect with some Republican lawmakers that think, well, voters voted for me, so they think that every decision I make is the decision they would make, and therefore I know better. I think that there is that mentality of, well, you might want Medicaid expansion, but you voted for me and I didn't want that. So I think it shouldn't happen. And I think that that's just a very narrow-minded view of thinking of voters. Obviously, there's multifaceted. There are clearly Republicans who voted for marijuana expansion and Medicaid expansion and the abortion amendment. They wouldn't have passed otherwise because Missouri right now is a red state. And I think that ultimately it's going to take kind of a different approach at looking at voters and not just saying, oh, well, they voted Republican, therefore they agree with me 100%. I think that's a recipe for failure when it comes to thinking that things won't go through the initiative petition process.
Coming in at number 2 was St. Louis County Prosecutor Wesley Bell defeating Congresswoman Cori Bush in the Democratic primary for the 1st Congressional District. Rachel, why do you think Bell was able to pull this one off?
Because he had money. I think that's the very easy answer to the question. Do I think he jumped in for was the reason that he gave for jumping into the race disingenuous? Absolutely. I don't know that for him, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was actually a top issue. It became a way for money from AIPAC and other groups to flow into Missouri. But I think fundamentally, he was just able to find messages that would influence Democratic voters and make them stick because he had so much money.
Here is Bell talking about the difference in issue position between Bush and himself when it comes to supporting Israel.
Anyone that tells you they know what peace in the Middle East, what that plan is, they're lying to you. But I will say the structure of any peaceful resolution, I think, has to involve keeping that door open for a two-state solution. But also, it cannot involve a terror state with the capacity to fire thousands of rockets and end the peaceful resolution, what we had prior to October 7th.
That is Congressman-elect Wesley Bell talking about his support for Israel after the October 7th attack from Hamas. I've talked a lot, Rachel, about how the 1st Congressional District is a majority African-American district, and polling shows that black voters don't see the Israeli-Gaza conflict as a top-of-mind issue. But it's not 100% African-American district. It has a significant white population. Well, I think that the Jewish population is split between the 1st and the 2nd. Mm-hmm. This issue clearly did motivate some Jewish voters to vote for Bell. There's no question about that.
No, I think you're absolutely correct in the sense that there are, I am certain, some Jewish voters who just could not abide by Cori Bush in some ways defending Hamas, which is different than defending the Palestinian people. And there were a lot of individuals who, either because they are ignorant about the politics of the Middle East, came out and say some things that are definitely ignorant and possibly borderline anti-Semitic, whether they intended that to be or not. I just think that for him, yes, he jumped in the race and said it was about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Whether that was the sole reason, I think that was the disingenuous part. But I'm certainly not questioning the motive of Jewish and other voters in that area, that their votes were because of Cori Bush's position on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Sarah, Rachel, myself, and you have been following Cori Bush's trajectory for a while. I don't think she's going to completely disappear. She could potentially run again in 2026 because she lost, but she didn't lose by a landslide. She still has support from within the 1st Congressional District. What do you think is next for her?
I mean, that's anybody's guess, right? But I wouldn't be surprised to see her run again in 26. If I remember, you were at that concession party, right? You were at her watch party.
I was, yes.
Her speech wasn't like it was a "don't worry, I'll be back" kind of vibe. I'm trying to remember because I know you were there, so I want to ask. I'm turning the tables and making you now the guest. What was her speech like? Because I'm trying to remember that, and I think that wasn't a very like the best person won goodbye kind of speech.
No.
Fiery would be how I would describe that.
There we go. So I would not be surprised to see her back. I think that there's definitely support for her still. I mean, I think that ultimately, once, Bell will be a first-time congressperson, and that's the time where a lot of people challenge in primaries. So I wouldn't be surprised if she's the only one, honestly.
And the number one story in Missouri, St. Louis politics, by a long shot, was the passage of Amendment 3, which legalized abortion in Missouri. And I would argue this passed because of Republicans like Tim Davis of Shelby County voting for GOP candidates like Kehoe and backing legal abortion.
I supported Amendment 3, not necessarily because I'm pro-choice, but I'm pro the government. It's none of the government's business. And I think that anytime the government's involved in medical decisions, it only goes bad. Especially when they want to see it as black and white, and nothing in that realm is really black or white.
That was Tim Davis, a Shelby County resident who voted for Amendment 3. We could talk about Amendment 3 for hours, but we only have a few minutes left. Sarah, I'll go to you first. I think both of us expected Amendment 3 to pass, but it was a close margin. Were you surprised by kind of how this shook out?
I think it was a little closer than I thought it would be in the end, but ultimately it did pass, and it wasn't, as narrow as sports betting. And I think you're right. It's because a lot of Republicans who might have voted for Mike Kehoe but turn around and you have to wonder if Missouri's abortion ban wasn't as strict as it was, with practically no exceptions except for emergency situations. And even then, that wasn't super clearly defined. So you have to wonder if we would be here now if that wasn't the prior legislation. And I don't know. And then also, it's not even that it passed in November. The story is also that it got started late to collect for signatures, and they got more than enough signatures. There were
Twice,
multiple,
I think.
There were multiple lawsuits on this, whether it was the delay on the fiscal note, and then there was a delay on the language. So it had lots of delays to even get to the signature collecting phase, and then it had challenges once it was on the ballot. So it overcame a lot just to be on the ballot at all. So it's kind of an all-encompassing thing of the process of getting it passed this year. I feel like it's just kind of definitely the biggest story of the year for Missouri.
I absolutely agree with Sarah. If the Missouri's abortion language ban is different, if it is not essentially a blanket ban, we don't even have a conversation about Amendment 3 even getting on the ballot, much less passing. And I think when the conversation and the campaign and the messaging around Amendment 3 shifted from what the language actually was towards talking about gender-affirming care for children, that was, I think, the moment, for me at least, where I was like, this is going to pass. The fact that they have to take and gin up, in my view, incorrect and irrational fears about something that isn't even in the ballot language, that to me was a sign that they are losing this conversation, and they knew that if it was solely on the issue of Missouri's abortion restrictions, they were going to lose with that messaging.
Sarah, Rachel, in the last minute or so that we have, what are going to be some of the stories you'll be following in the new year? Rachel, I'll start with you.
Well, I get the delight of having 2 election cycles every year because St. Louis has its crazy odd off-cycle municipal elections. So I will have a mayoral race to watch, and for the first time in, decades, there might actually be a competitive comptroller race in the city of St. Louis. So I get to watch that.
Oh, man. The only thing that's more exciting than a comptroller race
Recorder of Deeds
is a Recorder of Deeds race because, I love
Recorder of Deeds.
I love recording deeds. Sarah, what about you?
I mean, I would like to, we say, oh, the biggest story of the year is abortion. Sure, it might be the biggest story next year too. The lawmakers are not going to simply say, oh yes, lawmakers, voters passed it, we are going to let it be. No, there'll be statutory things, maybe defining what fetal viability is. Maybe there's going to be an opposing amendment that tries to pass muster. So I think there's going to be lots of conversation on that. I mean, as always, the legislature, you never know what's going to happen. We might be looking at income taxes. We might be looking at it'll definitely be looking at probably a smaller budget. So there's a lot of things that could be going in next year, but I definitely expect to continue to follow the results and consequences of passing Amendment 3.
And that's also what I'm going to be following. And my final word will actually be from some kind of hat via Reddit. Amendment 3, human rights, if you could keep it, which says to me this fight over abortion rights is going to go on for a very long time. Sarah Kellogg, Rachel Lippman, thank you for joining us and counting down the top stories in Missouri and St. Louis politics in 2024.
It's always fun, Jason.
The Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air is produced by Jason Rosenbaum, Alex Hoyer, Emily Woodbury, Danny Wysentowski, Maya Norfleet, and Elaine Cha. Audio engineering and sound design by Aaron Dorr. The politics editor is Fred Ehrlich, and our production intern is Roche Hemmings.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations. And leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thanks.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.